Hello, everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a truly wild piece of history. We're going to explore how massive American economic ambition and some incredibly rapid military maneuvers all culminated in one of the most shocking, highly orchestrated, and frankly, heavily staged historical events of the late 19th century. We are looking at the dramatic shift of global power from Spain to the United States, and how the Philippines got caught squarely in the crossfire. Okay, let's dive right into this. How do you win a war without actually fighting? Usually when we study conflicts between empires, we're reading about massive, bloody campaigns, right? But today, we're going to see how a decisive imperial victory was, well, it was actually a carefully crafted theatrical production. The fix was in, the script was written, and the outcome was completely decided before a single cannon was truly fired in anger.
Section 1, The Imperial Urge, Motives for Expansion.
To understand how we get to a literal fake battle, we first got to rewind a bit and look at why the United States, a nation that had mostly focused on its own frontiers, suddenly started looking outward across the oceans. This drive for colonization wasn't just a sudden whim. It was built on a very specific triad of motives. First up, American leaders at the time held this strong belief that they were essentially destined to spread their influence and their assistance across the entire world. It was viewed as a duty. Second, they really needed to stabilize and strengthen their domestic economy, especially by expanding their reach into Asia. And third, expansion was a prime way to promote American military force on the global stage, operating side by side with the goal of spreading Protestantism across Asia. So these three pillars, destiny, economics, and military religious strategy, were the engines pushing the nation toward becoming a colonial power.
Let's zoom in on that economic motive for a second. The late 19th century saw American industries booming like crazy. But to keep those factories humming, you absolutely need raw materials. And the Philippines? It was absolutely abundant in the exact natural resources the U.S. required for both agriculture and manufacturing. We're talking hemp, copra, sugar, rubber, coal, and iron. On top of extracting all these resources, the U.S. desperately needed a brand new overseas market where they could store and sell their surplus products and, build new commercial enterprises. The Philippines represented just a perfect economic opportunity.
So the crucial point here is the geography. It wasn't just about what was in the ground, it was about where that ground was actually located. The Philippines offered this incredibly strategic location in Asia. For the United States military, establishing a presence there meant creating a vital first line of defense against potential enemies across the Pacific. It provided the ultimate stepping stone for both military security and the spread of Protestantism in the East.
Section 2, The Cuban Spark. Tensions rise.
Now, what's really fascinating here is that the spark for the Pacific War actually ignited on the complete opposite side of the planet. Cuba and the Philippines shared a major connection. They were both colonies belonging to the Spanish Empire. But Cuba was sitting right in America's backyard. The United States, and specifically American capitalists, had poured huge investments into industries based in Cuba, particularly in the highly lucrative sugar trade. The U.S. government firmly believed it had the ultimate right, and really the obligation, to protect its American investors operating in Cuba. This financial stake set the stage for a massive escalation. On February 15, 1898, the American ship USS Maine mysteriously explodes and sinks right in Havana Harbor. Boom. The Americans instantly blame the Spaniards for the sinking. Spain, in turn, is absolutely furious at the ongoing American interference in its colonial affairs. This direct clash over Cuba resulted in Spain declaring war on the United States, which was a challenge the U.S. eagerly accepted. And just like that, the Spanish-American War begins. But the conflict didn't stay in Cuba for long. In a matter of months, the fight leapt all the way to Manila Bay and finally culminated in a mock battle in August.
Section 3, Battle of Manila Bay. Swift action.
The Second War was declared. The U.S. Navy wasted absolutely zero time acting on those imperial motives we talked about earlier. They immediately set their sights on the Spanish fleet halfway across the globe. Commodore George Dewey, who was stationed in Hong Kong at the time, gets a direct message from the Secretary of the U.S. Navy, John Long. The orders were crystal clear. Leave Hong Kong immediately, head straight for Manila, and locate and destroy the Spanish fleet. Dewey followed these orders to the letter. His fleet rolls into Manila Bay on May 1st, 1898. The very moment he spotted the Spanish fleet, which was commanded by Admiral Patricio Montojo, Dewey didn't hesitate. He launched an immediate, devastating attack. And just look at this stark contrast in the outcomes of this battle. Because the Spanish forces under Montojo were just completely unprepared for the sheer speed and ferocity of the American attack, it was totally one-sided. they were forced to surrender. The United States achieved a flawless naval victory without a single casualty on their side. Zero. Not one casualty. Meanwhile, the Spanish forces suffered many killed and wounded. Spanish naval power in the Pacific was effectively dismantled in a single day.
Section 4. The Staged Betrayal. Secret Maneuvers. Now, with the Spanish fleet destroyed, you might think the war was over. But taking the bay isn't the same as taking the city. This is where the narrative slows down, the secret backroom maneuvering begins, and the dramatic irony reaches its absolute peak. Commodore Dewey had control of the water, sure, but he didn't have the ground troops to take the walled city of Intramuros in Manila. He had to sit and wait for reinforcements from the U.S. Meanwhile, Filipino forces led by Emilio Aguinaldo launch an incredibly aggressive siege on Intramuros. Aguinaldo strategically cuts off all food and water supplies to Manila, actively trying to starve the Spaniards out and force a surrender. Aguinaldo is putting in the grueling work on the ground, fully believing the colonizers will soon capitulate to him. But here is the massive roadblock, the honor of Spain. The Spaniards were trapped, they were starving, and they were defeated. However, their imperial pride was on the line. The Spanish absolutely refused to yield to Aguinaldo and the Filipino forces because, in their eyes, surrendering to a colony they had ruled would completely destroy the honor of Spain. They were willing to lose the territory, but there was no way they were willing to lose face to the locals. This rigid sense of honor birthed literally one of the most astonishing deceptions in military history. Without Aguinaldo knowing a single thing about it, a secret agreement was struck between the Americans and the trapped Spaniards. Spain agreed they would surrender, but only to the Americans, absolutely not to the Filipinos. And to preserve that Spanish honor, so it wouldn't look like they just handed the city over, they agreed to stage a completely fake mock battle. They were going to put on a show to make it look like a real fight had occurred, entirely cutting Aguinaldo out of the victory he was actively working for just outside the walls. And this brilliantly illustrates just how tightly kept this secret was. The only individuals in the entire world who knew about this fake battle were American General Wesley Merritt, American Commodore George Dewey, and the Spanish Governor General Fermin Jodenes. That's it. 3 men orchestrating a theatrical production of war, while thousands of Filipino soldiers are camped outside, completely unaware that their supposed American allies were making backroom deals with the enemy. So how exactly did they pull it off? Well, they had to clear the stage. The Americans systematically began pushing Aguinaldo aside. General Merritt gave orders to General Francis Greene to formally request that Aguinaldo withdraw his troops from the shoreline to, quote, make way for the arriving American soldiers. Aguinaldo, still genuinely believing they were partners against Spain, complied with Greene's request. But as more and more U.S. ground troops continuously poured in, and as the Filipinos were continually marginalized from the front lines, Aguinaldo slowly began to experience this deep, sinking doubt about what the Americans' true intentions actually were. Which brings us to the climax on August 13th, 1898. The curtain rises on the mock battle of Manila. And guys, it went exactly according to the secret script. The Americans fired their cannons at the Spanish forts. There was a very brief, highly controlled exchange of gunfire just to make it look convincing. And then, right on cue, the Spaniards raised a white flag as a symbol of surrender. The theatrical performance was a total success. The staged battle ended, successfully preserving Spanish honor, formally ending Spanish rule, and marking the official dawn of the American occupation in Manila. This entire sequence of events leaves us with a really heavy, lingering question. When one empire stages a victory to replace another, what happens to the ally left waiting outside the gates? Aguinaldo and his forces had besieged the city. They had fought so hard for their own independence, only to watch a choreographed transfer of power completely lock them out of their own capital. This deeply cynical, staged betrayal didn't just end a war with Spain, it lit the fuse for a far more devastating and tragic conflict between the Filipinos and the Americans that was just over the horizon. Thank you all so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning history, and I'll catch you next time.